Hi. When I sent out a recent invitation to my 5 room dungeon workshop, I received several replies from game masters who said they don't use the 5 room dungeon method because they were worried about players metagaming it. So if you know the formula and you realize you're in a 5 room dungeon, then you can guess what's coming up. And so that's fair enough. But I also wanted to make sure that everyone knew that there are many options around 5 room dungeons, and you don't have to just use it literally for 5 rooms in those with all of those room types and story beats. Well, I'm here with Molly the Wonder Dog. She wants to hop up, I guess, and help out here. All right, say hey, hey Molly. Oh, all right, she's bored already. So, so yeah, I'm just going to go through some other notions around 5 room dungeons in an effort for you to get more mileage out of this technique if you choose to use it in your campaigns. And so what we have here is essentially 5 story beats. And these are derived, they're like a compression of Joseph Campbell's monomyth theory. And it also actually can function well within Vladimir Prop's mythical story structure theory as well. And so with just these 5 rooms, if we include them, then we're guaranteed to have a really solid story baked in. If we just follow the formula, we no longer have to figure out, well, is this a story or not? It's got the elements baked in. So for example, every story has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And that also happens to apply to the 3-act structure. The beginning would be our room 1, an entrance, and possibly room 2 as a map or a guide. And then the other rooms are about exploring your 5 room dungeon and ultimately reaching the final conflict, the chief obstacle, barrier, foe that's standing in the way of the players and the characters getting the loot, what it is that they want the most. And so then that's the middle act and the middle part of a story. And then our story concludes with the result of that epic combat, epic conflict, and what the players get as a reward, if anything. But usually they have some goal, a mission, or they're looking to update their character sheets, buff their character sheets with new items and equipment and ability scores and what have you. So all of that comes in room 5, and so that's the end of our story. So if we use this as a story beat concept, then we could actually use the 5 room dungeon as a storytelling tool within a single encounter. So the encounter must be triggered, it must start, and an encounter must end. So we've already got our beginning and end criteria, and then we have the gameplay development throughout the middle. So if we consider the start of an encounter the equivalent of room 1, how would this encounter trigger? How does it draw in the players? How does it signpost that there's really good treasure and some conflict coming up if they want to get at that treasure? And then we go through room 2, which is role-playing puzzle. That's about orientation as well. It's about gathering more information about what's possible here and starting to engage. Room 3 is a trick or setback, which is ultimately saying, well, things aren't going to be as easy as you thought. The encounter has some more meat to it than perhaps at first glance. Or it's all known at the front. You've given the proper clues and signposts and information to the players, so they know they're in for a fight. And room 3 is kind of a resource depletion kind of a trick where we are whittling down the characters and making the encounter more dramatic. And then, of course, the encounter results in some kind of conflict, which either you or the players or the dice can settle together. And then the encounter ends. Presumably, the characters bypass the obstacle and move on to continue on their adventure, or they get some treasure, or they get some knowledge, some plot clues. It's just 3 ideas of what might be in an encounter resolution stage. So we can use the 5 room dungeon format for single encounters as well. Likewise, the other side of the coin of an encounter is a situation. So you can use the 5 room dungeon as story beats for a situation as a situation unfolds. 5 room dungeons also make awesome one-shots because they can be developed in isolation with no dependencies. You can just bring in the characters, trigger the adventure, and away you go. I'll return to why you can add more rooms and whatnot to a 5 room dungeon to flesh out a one-shot if you're worried that a single 5-room dungeon would be too short. I had that conversation with a couple of GMs recently by email as well. So I'll return to that idea. You can also stitch together multiple 5-room dungeons, as I have in the icon here. So you can add multiple to be an entire dungeon level. So you could have 3 or 4 or 7 dungeons, 5-room dungeons connected. And I like this approach to adventure design, where you have multiple connected 5-room dungeons, because as a friend had showed me a long time ago when playing Risk, he said, well, there's two approaches to Risk. There's coconut and rock. And a coconut is a hard outer shell and it's soft in the middle. So coconut strategy in Risk is that you have all of your armies around your borders, protecting your borders, allowing you to put more armies on those borders and creating a barrier for the other players to have to force them to break through in order to conquer any territory. But then, as you know, if they do drive a wedge through probably the weakest area in your chain, in your border, your Maginot line, then the rest is soft. You've got like one army countries and they can just rage through. So that's the coconut theory. The rock theory is that you have armies on most, if not all, of your territories, so that players cannot just go through and wipe you out that way. But it means that there's an easier entry into your territories. It's just more friction along. So you'll slow their advance. You wouldn't stop it on the front line. But that also means you dilute your armies, and so any individual territory is poorly protected versus stacking up on that. So if you consider that for our dungeon and adventure creation, if your adventure consists of sections, let's call them milestones, and each milestone has an intrinsic story baked into it with a beginning, middle, and end, and all of the excitement and action involved in role-playing and puzzles and tricks and climactic battles and conflicts. If you have all of that in every area of your dungeon, you've got an amazing dungeon adventure on your hands. So that's like the rock theory. You don't just have a really interesting initial encounter and a really interesting treasure at the end, and then the rest of it is boring. You make sure that each of it section of your dungeon is got that story structure baked into it. And then again, same thing as I'm saying, not just for levels in a dungeon, but you can stitch together, connect 5-room dungeons to make out your entire adventure. And that can be as long as you like. So you can have 25-room dungeons over the course of an epic adventure. And then finally, you can stitch together 5-room dungeons into mega dungeons in the same way. So you divide your mega dungeons into levels or zones, and then those zones have smaller areas or subzones in them that are themed and that have their own intrinsic kind of logic to them. And this allows you to make deeper gameplay at scale, which is a challenge, like especially with Dungeon 23. How am I going to come up with 365 original ideas for rooms? But if you break them up into sections that are 5-room dungeons, each with their own conflict and reason for being, and how do you enter them, and what's the reward at the end, then you have really deep gameplay. So the final thing I just wanted to show you along this lines, that you don't have to follow 5-room dungeon in linear fashion and just have 5 encounters, is first a Gnome Stew article. This is an old article from 2012 by Matthew, and so he has just basically laid out all of the rooms in configurations. And you don't have to have room 1 followed by room 2 followed by room 3, 4, and then 5. You can play with the combinations. And so I just encourage you to read this article over at Gnome Stew to explore the ideas. And for example, like just pick one at random, the paw here, E. So E has an entrance, that's your E. And then presumably we have room 2, which is role play or puzzle. So this is an opportunity to learn more about what's coming up, or maybe there's a role-playing or puzzle block, obstacle to getting to the rest of it. Doesn't matter. But now it looks like from room 2, we can access room 3, 4, or 5. Players can access them equally. So the next choice will lead them to one of the next rooms. Knowing that in advance, that is the possible player or character journey throughout it, where 1 is mandatory, 2 is mandatory, and then 3, 4, or 5 are equally accessible from room 2. I would design room 3 to 5 with that in mind. It becomes an interesting GM game or puzzle of how I would create a dungeon with understanding that the players could go to room 5 immediately after room 2 and get their just rewards, or are they just after all? And so yes, consider the information in this article as another way to make sure the players can't metagame your mega dungeons. And then the second article is over on Critical Hits. This is penned by Dave Chalker and in 2011. And he has a 5x5 method, which works awesome with 5-room dungeons. So he would stitch together 5 basically adventures, or we'll call them 5-room dungeons. He's not using the 5RD format, but you can, I'm discussing how we would use it, layer it in. So he has 5 adventures, each with 5 steps, 5x5. So what we would do is have 5-room dungeons, each with 5 rooms. That gives us 25 encounters. We're no longer stuck with a 5-room adventure. We now have a 25-room adventure. And then a final note here is that you can add more encounters to a 5-room dungeon. It's just the story beats that form a critical story path that I want us to hit most times for the most satisfying story possible. So basically the 5-room dungeon format says, hey, there's an adventure here. Do you want to enter? Do you want to get involved in it? Do you want to leave the normal world and go into a strange new world? And then you go through the different beats until finally the story ends in some kind of conflict. Can the players overcome the obstacle? Or can they defeat the evil foes? Or can they cure something? Or can they rescue something? And that is the room 4, their mission. And then we get a reward. You can add rooms 6 and 7 and 8 and 9 that don't hit those story beats, or that are multiple room 2s and there are multiple room 4s. You can do that and play with the design as much as you want. What we really want, though, is at least one of those story beats to be in all of our dungeons, because they are derived from mythical story structure, where Joseph Campbell discovered that cultures regarded... My dog is pounding a, what is that squeaky toy? A frog. A stuffed frog with a squeaker in it. Awesome. That's my soundtrack. And so yeah, we don't have to have that exact number of rooms. We just want to hit Joseph Campbell's key points of what makes the most legendary stories, the Iliad and others, and then many from indigenous cultures that he studied, why they all overlap and have common story beats to them. And what are those story beats? Well, he created the monomyth theory that academically that creates that, models that, and then 5-room dungeon is a small condensed version of that. So in effect, if you follow the 5-room dungeon, regardless of how many rooms or if you stitch them together and whatnot, we're going to have really solid story structure to achieve. So I hope that makes sense. In this video, you're not restricted to how you use 5-room dungeons. There are many combinations. If you still don't like the method, that's totally fine, but do not feel bound to use exactly 5 rooms every time in linear format. Use your imaginations to come up with anything. Try to break it, try to enhance it, and then hopefully if you find some cool new things, you'd share them out. I'd love to hear about it, but hopefully this helps you get more mileage out of your 5-room dungeons moving forward. Thanks for your time.